Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. William Davis, cardiologist and author of the Wheat Belly series of books and more recently, Super Gut. I'd like to talk in depth about omega-3 fatty acids that have been a topic of controversy for the last 25 or so years, ever since the epidemiologic evidence suggesting that people who consume more seafood had fewer cardiovascular events like heart attacks. The evidence has been mixed, and so it's caused a lot of skepticism and a lot of confusion, and it hasn't helped that there's been a lot of misleading marketing. So I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss in detail what the evidence really does tell us, and it has clarified in the last few years thanks to some larger clinical trials that used higher doses, and I'll also discuss why some of the earlier studies failed to provide conclusive findings. So let's dive in deep. So let's try and clear up some of the uncertainties that have surrounded omega-3 fatty acids from fish oil over the last few years. So let's discuss how omega-3 fatty acids now have evidence for beneficial effects across a number of conditions, including reproductive health in females, the neurological maturation of children, cardiovascular health, perhaps the most confusing of all, and even autoimmune conditions. Let's discuss the methodological problems that plague virtually all studies involving omega-3 fatty acids that tended to underestimate their benefits. Let's discuss a very simple test you can do in the comfort of your home called an RBC omega-3 index done via fingerstick that can show you whether your level of intake is adequate or not. And then let's talk about the influence of misleading marketing that has plagued this industry and this supplement for the last 20 years due to the uncertainty that came about from some of the mixed findings in clinical trials. Now, I remind everybody that omega-3 fatty acids are a component of food, and they are not a drug. I point that out because when you talk about a component of food, we typically have to talk about gram quantities, not milligram quantities. And yet, omega-3 fatty acids were often regarded as a drug or a supplement, and thereby low doses were used. Imagine I told you that eggs are good for you, and I think we can agree that they are. They're full of protein, fats, and other nutrients like beta-carotene. But an average large egg weighs about 60 grams. What if I told you we're going to study whether eggs are good for you by giving you 1 gram or 1,000 milligrams? How much benefit would you expect? Probably none, right? Because it's a component of food, and food exerts effects at gram quantities, not milligram quantities, speaking generally. Let's start by talking about reproductive health in women of reproductive age. It's well established that women who are reproductive age and getting pregnant, having children, are miserably deficient in omega-3 fatty acids. And that increases the potential for premature delivery, premature labor, which can be catastrophic to the child. If a child, say, is delivered at 28 weeks, that person will be plagued by immunological, neurological, and psychological problems for a lifetime. So it's there's high increased risk for mortality, of dying, when a child is delivered prematurely. So premature delivery, very serious matter. And without omega-3 fatty acids, a woman is more likely to deliver a child prematurely. She's more likely to have a miscarriage and lose that child. And the child whose neurological maturation begins in utero will be impaired if the mom is deprived or lacks omega-3 fatty acids. And during breastfeeding, if most women who breastfeed are deficient in omega-3 fatty acids, it means the child is not getting much in the way of omega-3 fatty acids for neurological maturation. And as the child breastfeeds, he or she progressively depletes the mother of what little omega-3 fatty acids she has, and thereby the child becomes more and more deficient over time, amplifying the adverse effects of lacking omega-3 fatty acids for brain development. It is well established through a couple of dozen studies that supplementation of omega-3 fatty acids reduce the risk of premature labor. So that alone, a big reason for women, at least, to supplement or obtain omega-3 fatty acids. And if we look at the trial evidence in its entirety, it suggests that doses of at least 2,000 milligrams of total EPA and DHA per day are the doses that truly work. For many years, people were a little bit reluctant to increase the dose because they were fearful of bleeding, especially uterine bleeding at time of delivery. But that has never been demonstrated. That is, there's been no episodes of excess bleeding that could be blamed on omega-3 fatty acids. Sometimes my colleagues and others will say things like fish oil or omega-3 fatty acids thin the blood. That is not true. They don't thin the blood, they normalize blood clotting. There's a difference. Normalization of blood clotting is a good thing. So there's been no hemorrhage at time of delivery or other situations, even in people who take other kinds of blood thinners. If they take warfarin or Eliquis, for instance, there is no excess risk of bleeding when you add fish oil or omega-3 fatty acids. Now, because an infant requires omega-3 fatty acids even in utero as well as during breastfeeding, here's a study in which mothers were given DHA, 2.2 grams or 2,200 milligrams of DHA, and 1.1 grams or 1,100 milligrams of EPA per day during pregnancy. And then their children tested for cognitive abilities at age 2.5. And the children whose moms got omega-3 fatty acids performed at a superior level in cognitive ability. So very important for cognitive maturation in children. Even adults obtain cognitive benefit by supplementing omega-3 fatty acids. So people who have normal cognition have better cognition, improved with omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. This also applies to people with early cognitive impairment. So people who may be on their way to Alzheimer's dementia. If they take a significant dose of omega-3 fatty acids, it slows the deterioration in mental capacity. Now, unfortunately, once Alzheimer's dementia is established and you've got cerebral atrophy and hippocampal atrophy, those are the changes that accompany dementia, then omega-3 fatty acids really don't exert much benefit. So the key here is to start early in life, preferably at birth, or preferably with your mom while you're in utero. Now, here's a study of omega-3 supplementation in adults with early cognitive impairment. So a modest dose, 720 milligrams EPA or 0.7 grams, right? Or 480 milligrams of DHA. So relatively low doses, but nonetheless, when cognitive abilities were measured in these adults with early cognitive impairment, there was measurable improvement in multiple measures of cognition with supplementation of even the low dose of omega-3 fatty acids. And once again, if we look at the data in its entirety, it's higher doses, certainly higher than 2,000 milligrams per day, where most benefit is obtained. Now let's tackle the most difficult area of all, omega-3 fatty acids and cardiovascular events. So this whole conversation got started when it was observed that populations in the world, such as the Inuit, the Eskimos, or Japanese or South Koreans, who have a seafood-based culture, have fewer cardiovascular events. Now, that kind of analysis cannot prove cause and effect. And so this prompted studies, clinical studies. The first large study was the Gissi Prevenzione study, an Italian study that did suggest a reduction in cardiovascular events. But it was followed by smaller studies that showed no benefit. And that's where a lot of the confusion came. So despite the positive findings of the Italian study, there were negative findings by several small studies. But more recently, that has changed with the release of several very large studies, such as the JELIS, VITAL, REDUCE IT, EVAPORATE, and HEARTS, and some others that we'll discuss, that showed once and for all, yes, omega-3 fatty acids do confidently reduce cardiovascular events, risk for cardiovascular events, and probably do more than reported in these studies. And this is further borne out by so-called meta-analyses, that is the combined data of all these studies, all analyzed together, that holds up this idea that omega-3 fatty acids do indeed reduce risk for cardiovascular events. So here's one of the analyses that shows that people who consume more seafood have fewer cardiovascular events. You know, there's very rare heart attacks in South Korea or Japan. It doesn't tell us cause and effect, of course. So that has to be left up to clinical trials. So the first was Gissi Prevenzione. I'm sorry about this fuzzy graph, but the topmost graph is survival in people who got a modest dose of 1,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA, or 1 gram per day. So these 11,000 people who took omega-3 fatty acids after a heart attack had a reduction in heart attacks or events of 10% on fish oil. But then These smaller studies that did not show benefit, such as this one, 350 people after heart attack, more significant dose in this case of EPA and DHA, 4,000 milligrams, but there was no reduction in cardiovascular events over 3 years. So this and some other studies threw a lot of doubt on whether fish oil or omega-3 fatty acids did indeed reduce risk for cardiovascular events. But then studies started to come out that did show benefit. Here's the JELIS trial of 19,000 people. And these are all people living in Japan who live, of course, this seafood-rich culture. So they start with a higher level, baseline level of omega-3 fatty acids in their bloodstream. They were supplemented with 1,800 milligrams of EPA alone, and everybody took statin drugs. You're going to see that's true in all the future studies, that everybody's on statin drugs because that is the prevailing standard, and it's felt to be unethical to not have people take a statin drug, though I think that's absurd. But nonetheless, that is how these studies were conducted. Everybody takes a statin drug. So statin plus placebo compared to statin plus 1,800 milligrams of EPA, and there was indeed a 19% reduction in cardiovascular events over about 5 years. The VITAL study, very large study, 25,000 participants, but once again a low dose of 1,000 milligrams, 1 gram of EPA and DHA over 5 years. But there was a 27% reduction in heart attack, myocardial infarction, and it held up across analyses of various subsets: men, women, age, diabetes or no diabetes, hypertension, no hypertension. So it held up, suggesting that there is indeed a genuine effect. And here's the results of a combined or meta-analysis. And you can see, combine all the studies up till recently, positive and negative, did indeed suggest a reduction in events. Now we're going to talk about the REDUCE-IT trial that really pushed the bar towards showing, yes, events are reduced by omega-3 fatty acids. So here's that REDUCE-IT trial. 8,000 participants, so once again a large number. In this case, 4,000 milligrams of a form of EPA called icosapenthyl ethyl. This is the pharmaceutical brand called Vascepa. Now, why did they do that? It's really nothing more than an ethyl ester, just like other fish oils you buy at the health food store. Why they added extra group? Not for efficacy. It was not added for efficacy. It was added for patent protection. Okay, so don't be confused by that. Nonetheless, 4,000 milligrams of EPA over 5 years versus placebo. Remember, everybody's on a statin drug, so it's statin plus EPA or statin plus placebo, and the people who got omega-3 fatty acids had a 25% reduction in cardiovascular events like heart attack. And like the other study, analyses of subgroups held up that association, that regardless of whether you're diabetic or not, male, female, etc., that relationship held up. That EPA supplementation reduced risk for cardiovascular events. Now, here's where the world really changed. Two very important studies. The EVAPORATE and the HEARTS trial both involved something called CT coronary angiography. And all that means is the device used to generate coronary calcium scores, a CT device, a CAT scan device, where you're given an IV and you receive intravenous contrast. So you can see details in the coronary arteries, and you can quantify the various components. You can quantify not just calcium, as we do with calcium scoring, but also the soft elements, here labeled low attenuation plaque. That's the stuff that ruptures and causes heart attack and sudden cardiac death, but also fibrofatty plaque and fibrous plaque. Fibrofatty is a mixture of soft and fibrous of course has more fibrous elements like fibrin and collagen. So in this EVAPORATE trial, conducted by Matt Budoff at UCLA, people were given 4,000 milligrams of EPA or placebo. Now recall that everybody's on a statin drug. So in red is statin alone, in blue is statin plus EPA. You can see that the people on statin drug alone had dramatic progression, worsening of their heart disease. That is an expansion or growth of coronary atherosclerotic plaque. And the people who had EPA added had mild regression or reversal of coronary atherosclerotic plaque. Likewise, and that was of the soft plaque. Likewise, fibrofatty plaque, progression on statin alone, regression with addition of EPA. And then likewise, fibrous, really no change on statin alone, modest regression of fibrous plaque with addition of the fish oil. Calcium didn't change much on fish oil, but did progress on statin drug. Now here's the heart's trial, very similar, but in this case, 3,360 milligrams, 3.3 grams of EPA and DHA over 2.5 years. Everybody's on a statin, and then CT coronary angiography performed at baseline and then follow-up at 2.5 years. Now in this case, one of the rare studies where they actually measured a baseline omega-3 RBC index, which was 3.3%. We're going to talk about that. That's very common for Americans who don't consume much seafood. And very similar in people who got statin alone in blue, there was progression of disease. People who added the EPA and DHA had regression of disease. That is a reduction in the volume of coronary atherosclerotic plaque. Likewise, total plaque worse on statin, modest regression with addition of fish oil, and it looks as if the odds are stacked in favor of regression when blood pressure was maintained at 125 millimeters of mercury or less, and if triglycerides were kept at a low value. Recall in my programs, we aim for a triglyceride level of no higher than 60 milligrams per deciliter to maximize the reduction in the particles that cause heart disease, such as VLDL and small LDL. But in this case, at 110 or less, you are more likely to obtain regression. And for what it's worth, because I don't use this measure, I think it's not very helpful, but nonetheless, in this study, they reported that people who obtained a non-HDL cholesterol value of less than 100 milligrams per deciliter also seemed to favor regression. But we now have two of these clinical trials where the details of coronary atherosclerotic plaque were imaged in detail, that the addition of omega-3 fatty acids facilitated regression, and that statin alone allows progression. So you have to call into question whether the statin drugs adds anything at all. And even further, the people who had enjoyed regression of plaque had fourfold fewer cardiovascular events compared to people who experienced progression. Now, those of you who have any familiarity with my programs, note that while I applaud these studies, they're very helpful. Compared to what we do in our programs, there's a lack of vitamin D. Had they added vitamin D, you can only answer so many questions in the clinical trials. This is not a criticism of those clinical trials, but I want you to know that you can do better than what they achieved in those clinical trials. So they did not use vitamin D. Had they used vitamin D, they would have obtained reduction of calcium scores as well. There was no attention, of course, to iodine or thyroid status. Thyroid disease is everywhere, and it's a major cardiovascular risk factor, and you can pay attention to that and obtain those benefits. Magnesium was not addressed, and magnesium is influential over insulin resistance, blood sugar, blood pressure, other factors, where we're going to add magnesium for added benefit. And of course, there was no attention paid to the microbiome, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, or lipopolysaccharide endotoxemia, major drivers of cardiovascular risk. If you have coronary disease, you very likely have SIBO and thereby endotoxemia as a driver of risk, as well as risk for other conditions, and that was not addressed. So you can do better than the people in these studies, and you can obtain regression more often than not. That's what we see every day in my programs. We see regression of coronary atherosclerotic plaque. So once again, in that combined analysis where the positive and the negative studies were all lumped together and reanalyzed, there is indeed a reduction in cardiovascular events. Now, there's also benefit in reducing some of the phenomena of autoimmune diseases. The best studied is rheumatoid arthritis, and people who with rheumatoid arthritis who supplement omega-3 fatty acids have a reduction in pain, an improvement in joint function, but once again, it seems to require higher doses of at least 2 grams or 2,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA per day to achieve these beneficial effects. This is not a cure for rheumatoid arthritis, but improved many of the phenomena associated with rheumatoid arthritis. Now, there are methodological problems with all these studies on omega-3 fatty acids that have served to underestimate their benefits. As you saw, the doses are often too low. I didn't show you some of the very early studies where they used small milligram quantities. It wouldn't be uncommon to see 60 milligrams, for instance, of EPA or 100 milligrams of DHA, so very low doses of this component of food. As you see, there's a mixture of EPA or DHA used in these studies. It's not quite clear whether one is better than the other or both are necessary, but you'll see that EPA seems to play a larger role in reducing cardiovascular events, while DHA likely plays a larger role in preservation of cognitive health because the brain is largely DHA. So both are probably important. The evidence is a bit confusing because there's a variety of different forms sometimes used. There's the triglyceride form of omega-3s. That's the form that occurs in fish naturally. When you eat a piece of salmon, you're getting the triglyceride form. There's the ethyl ester form, which is the most common form in fish oil supplements. There's the phospholipid form from krill oil. And there's the icosapentalyl ethyl form. That's the prescription form as Vasipa. And there's monoglyceride form that occurs in some forms of the nutritional supplement. And these studies also typically do not measure a baseline EPA and DHA because it can vary. While most Americans are indeed low to start, there are some people who make a habit of eating more fish and seafood and thereby start with higher levels. And they shouldn't be expected to have the same magnitude of benefit because they already have some exposure to EPA and DHA. And there's been no effort to adjust for body size or total fat in the body, nor absorption. And they can be major influences over how much omega-3s you obtain in your body. So here's an example. These are women whose RBC omega-3 indexes were measured and then correlated to their weight. You can see that the heavier they are on the x-axis, the lower the blood levels of EPA and of DHA. So if we give an overweight or obese woman omega-3 fatty acids, and we give the same dose to a slender woman, they're going to have two completely different outcomes. The overweight or obese ladies will not obtain the same kind of benefit because they're not getting as much reflected in their body's tissues nor in their blood. So no study looked at this, that is, at the start, by dose adjusting to weight their dose of omega-3 fatty acids. So once again, an underestimation of the benefits of omega-3s. Now, one way to level the playing field is to measure how much omega-3s are in your body. And this is an easy test that measures the percentage of omega-3s in the cell membranes of red blood cells, because red blood cells are easy to obtain. If you wanted to know the level of omega-3 in the rest of your body, you'd have to do a biopsy, and no one wants to do that. So this is a good surrogate for what the level of omega-3 is in the rest of the body. It's an inexpensive fingerstick blood test called an RBC omega-3 index. And by the way, I have no relationship with the company. It's just a good test. If we look at the RBC omega-3 index levels across the world, we find that the U.S. is very low, typically below 4%. We compare it to the levels in Japan or South Korea, they're typically above 8% because of their seafood consuming culture. And of course, they have very rare heart attacks and sudden cardiac death. Now, that does not prove cause and effect, but it's pretty interesting, isn't it? Here's one perspective on trying to understand what an ideal omega-3 index might be. This is correlating the RBC omega-3 index to hippocampal size. Recall that it's the hippocampus in the brain that atrophies as you experience cognitive impairment and dementia. And in this situation, you see that an omega-3 RBC index at 11% was associated with maximum hippocampal volume, suggesting that it's a level towards that 11 or so that is probably ideal, at least for cognitive health. And if we look at other studies, you can see the average American typically falls below 4%. And the studies that suggest cognitive preservation, a reduction in cardiovascular events, improved reproductive health, enhanced childhood neurological maturation, and maximum reduction of triglycerides tend to require an omega-3 index above 10%. So for that reason, we're aiming for 10 to 12%. Now, I remind everybody that marketing is not evidence. And I point that out because there's been a lot of confusion, especially when those negative studies came out a few years back. So we need to ignore all the claims made by nutritional supplement or drug manufacturers who sell fish oil. For instance, the krill oil people will say things like their product is 40 times more potent than fish oil. This is absolute nonsense. This is not true. In fact, krill is a minor source of EPA and DHA. The quantities contained are typically below 100 milligrams, below a 0.1 gram. So you have to take almost the entire bottle every day to achieve similar levels to other forms of fish oil. Now, not to say that it doesn't have its own benefits, but you cannot use krill, and it's certainly not true that it's 40 times more potent. What they're referring to is the antioxidative effects of the astaxanthin contained. But the quantity of astaxanthin in krill is so minor as to not be very helpful. It's less than a milligram. 3 times better absorption, that is also a fiction. It's a misinterpretation of the evidence, just a marketing claim. Or some of the drug people would say things like, you can't get this in a health food store. That means, of course, nothing. There's nothing magical about getting something by prescription. I remind you of this because there's a lot of poor or misinformation propagated by people who stand to make money from these supplements. And the shame of it is that the evidence is now very solid that omega-3 fatty acids do indeed provide benefits across a number of health conditions. Now, there are differences in the absorbability of different forms. So the phospholipid form in krill is better absorbed a little bit, 10-20% or so, but the quantity obtained in krill is so small as not really make a difference. The triglyceride form is the form that occurs naturally in fish. That's a very good form, a little better absorbed than the ethyl ester form, the most common form. But we're talking about typically 10 or 20% differences. So to understand this, let me draw an analogy. Pretend you're going to go on a road trip from where you live, let's say New York City. You go to the car rental agency, and they say you can rent a Mini Cooper that gets 32 miles per gallon, or a Jeep Grand Cherokee that gets 22 miles per gallon, or how about a vintage Roadmaster that gets 6 miles per gallon? Which car is going to get you to New York faster if you obey the speed limit with each car? You're going to get there regardless, right? Same thing with fish oil. Don't worry too much about the form. You can obtain all the wonderful benefits of omega-3 fatty acids by just adjusting your dose to the target RBC omega-3 index. So in other words, you can get there with triglyceride form, you can get there with the ethyl ester form. You probably can't get there with the krill oil form, but most of the time you can get there just by taking one form or another. Now, it's helpful to know that most people who take 3,000 to 3,600 milligrams per day of combined EPA and DHA nearly always obtain an RBC omega-3 index of 10% or greater. But as you see, if you're overweight or obese or have gastrointestinal problems might impair absorption, such as SIBO, you might want to check an RBC omega-3 index, a finger stick for $49 to make sure you're up at that 10% or higher level. And if you're not, simply increase the dose. If you're taking, for instance, 3,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA as the ethyl ester form, just increase the dose, maybe to 3,300 or 3,400. It's that easy. So don't worry too much about the form, but have some concern about whether you're achieving the target ideal level of 10% or greater. Now, just a word about fish oil quality. There is an agency called the International Fish Oil Standards that provides certification. If your fish oil doesn't have it, doesn't mean it's not good. It just means if it does have it, you have an added level of assurance that it has lack of contaminants. There's also testing by a company called Consumer Lab that you can subscribe to for low cost. And they periodically do a review or a test of a lot of fish oil products. And the only real problem that's cropped up is the presence of excessive oxidative breakdown products. And so 3 brands shown here failed, and many did pass, of course, but these 3 failed, and you can recognize excessive oxidation by smell. So healthy fish oil with minimal oxidation will smell a little fishy, but fish oil that's excessively oxidized will smell like dead fish. So if you open your container and it smells like dead fish, return it or throw it away or buy a new product because it's excessively oxidized, or check with one of these agencies to see what they came up with. So there you have it. If you've learned something from this conversation that I hope sheds light on the benefits of omega-3 fatty acid, despite all the controversies and misinformation over the years, I invite you to join me in my conversations on my blog, which is williamdavismd.com, or my 2-way conversations we have in the inner circle, drdavisinfinitehealth.com, or of course on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.